I have to say that the relationship between the Athens Center and me and Patty and Penn State generally is reciprocal. And for those of you, so happy to see so many students here tonight from the recently arrived groups from AHA and from Chicago. My understanding from having spoken with some of you is that most, or not, if not all of you, are in Greece for the first time, and certainly your first encounter with the Athens Center, and you're in for a real treat. You're going to have a good time. It's a great place to be able to spend time as a base of operations to learn about Athens and Greece generally, and certainly to conduct your studies. So, welcome. From those of us who've been here since January, welcome to Athens and to the Athens Center. And thank you all for taking the time out of your evenings to come here tonight and have me talk about this. As Rosemary indicated, the book project that I'm talking about tonight is started during a sabbatical leave that I spent working at the American School of Classical Studies here in Athens back in the spring of 1987. And it has proceeded, sort of in fits and starts since then. It sort of depended on my doing field research, which I was able to conduct on numerous visits to not just Greece, but also to Greek sites in Sicily and into western part of Anatolia over the last 25 years to look at places. And as you'll see what some of them are up here as I kind of orient you a little bit further on. Is this gone on beyond where I want it to be? That's good. And yes, my friend and colleague Richard Graff of the University of Minnesota and I have embarked together over the last 5 years now on bringing this long-term project to fruition. Indeed, Professor Graff was a graduate student at Northwestern University when he first encountered one of my early publications about this project, and we struck up a friendship as a result of that. He finished his doctoral work. He's now an associate professor at University of Minnesota, and we agreed 4 or 5 years ago to collaborate on this project, and so we're proceeding in great partnership, and it's working out very well. What I'm going to do this evening is to give you, as Rosemary has said, sort of an interim report on some of the findings that have come about as a result of this study. I'll give you some background on the project as a whole, and then, as I said, I want to kind of focus on a couple dimensions that we've been concentrating on and show you some stuff, basically. So I'll come back to that. The starting point for this project really, I suppose, is in a way what led me to be a student of rhetoric to begin with. I started my undergraduate career at University of California, Davis as an aerospace engineering major. And I ran into calculus, which was not my strong suit. But I took, as a sophomore, a basic public speaking class. And I had a very good instructor, and that's the way an awful lot of what we used to call speech majors. A lot of folks get into rhetoric in the study of human communications. They take a class, a required class or otherwise. Mine wasn't. In public speaking, and find, either because they have a really good instructor, or because they find something about the subject matter that interests them, or both, and that was the case with me, that there's something here worth looking at. And indeed, I took more courses and the interest grew. And I suppose the root of it is a fascination with human talk. We are, as life forms, and I suppose this is true of all life forms, but certainly in terms of ours, hardwired to be responsive to the sound of the human voice. You think about how attentive we are to the sounds of babies crying, let's hope not this evening, and if we're in a strange place to hear the sound of someone speaking our own language, for example. We all, I'm sure, have had experiences of hearing a speaker whose voice has moved us. This is obvious in the case of things like poetry readings and song. It's less obvious, but if you think about it, no less likely when we hear oratory. Of course, the paradigmatic example of modern times is Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Recognized by the scholars of rhetoric in the U.S. as having been the outstanding example of public oratory of the 20th century. And if you listen to that speech, and you listen to his words, the words are important, to be sure, and his use of language, but it's also what he does with his voice that grabs us. And if you listen to how he uses that voice as an instrument, and indeed, one might say that the human voice is the original musical instrument. We sang before we did anything else, and hummed and chanted and all those kinds of things. Something about the sound of our voice that we respond to, not just orally or aurally. It doesn't matter of hearing it. There is fairly decent amount of physiological research that indicates that we respond to the sound of the voice physically. It moves us, it touches us. We listen to an outstanding speaker, and in the case of Dr. King's speech, for example, we get chills up and down our backs. Or to another outstanding orator. You can take your pick from your own experiences who might fill that niche for you. But nonetheless, speech can move us. The sophist Gorgias, in his Encomium of Helen, presumably presented here in Athens actually after he arrived here from his home in Sicily, said, speech is a powerful lord, dynastis megas, a powerful lord. Of course, dynastis is an interesting term here. A lord is something or someone who must be obeyed. And speech, as he puts it, has the power not just to command attention, but to create anger or to allay it, to create pity, to arouse various kinds of emotional responses. And he likened the effect of speech on the human soul as to the effect of drugs on the body. He talked about speech as being at its most powerful like a form of magic. He talked about incantation and about the power of enchantment. And again, for any of us who have listened to a wonderful speaker, an eloquent speaker, male or female, who's able to present the sounds of speech, again, as Dr. King did, taking advantage of the opportunities in the words that were chosen for rhythm and cadence and accent, we get caught up in that and carried along by it. We see that very easily again in the case of poetry. Gorgias said he deems speech to be poetry without meter, or poetry to be speech with meter. And so unmetered speech is prose, metered speech is poetry, but for Gorgias and for an awful lot of eloquent speakers throughout the course of history, Western history to be sure, it has been cadenced rhythmical speech that has done that, had that kind of effect on us. So that's the starting point. That led me to wonder, as it happened, as I was kind of planning for this sabbatical back in the early 80s that I took in the mid 80s, if there would not be some way of discovering what it would have been like in ancient Greece to have actually heard eloquent speakers speaking. What do we know about those settings? And at that point, I didn't know very much, as a matter of fact. And as it happens, through the research I've done the last 25 years, nor do many other people. There has not been much in the way of systematic study of the actual material conditions under which Greek orators gave their speeches. We know the kinds of settings that there were: law courts, council houses, the agora, the open air of the marketplace to be sure, assembly meeting places, theaters, amphitheaters, battlefields, private homes, as far as that goes. But in connection with actually trying to understand what it would have been like to hear a Gorgias, or a Pericles, or a Demosthenes, or an Aeschines speak in those places during the times that they lived and exercised rhetorical influence here in Athens, not much there. So I set out to find out what could be found out about that. And what I did along the way was to investigate, first of all, everything I could find in terms of archaeological evidence, both recorded scholarship and on-site visits, about these different kinds of sites. Hence my visits to Greek sites in Sicily and in the Greek mainland, the Peloponnesus, Greek islands, Western Anatolia, southwestern Anatolia, to visit as many of these sites as I could and see what the stones on the ground could actually speak to me. There's a book called The Greek Stones Speak, and I suppose if you listen hard enough you can hear that. What could they tell? But there's an awful lot of published scholarship certainly that allows us to restore within limits of probability what some of these structures were like. Certainly with respect to some of the places here in Athens, we can do that with, in some cases, fairly high levels of confidence. In other cases, not so much. But there's enough evidence in any case, and certainly the scholarship for the last century or more, archaeological scholarship that's investigated these sites, has produced enough data that using those things plus site visits, Richard and I have been able to begin the process of reconstructing a fairly extensive sample of what these settings were like. And using that as a foundation, what we've done is to go on then and try to get into the heart of the question. What would it have been like both to hear a speaker there, but also, and this is the other side of it, to give speeches in some of those settings. Because after all, it's not just the listener who is affected by the process of speech giving. The speaker himself, and in those, I would say him or herself, because it's the way I talk, but we're talking about antiquity, and in the settings we're talking, of course, a patriarchal society where the public role of women was highly circumscribed. So forgive me if I say he, I'm referring literally then to the speakers of that era. But at any rate, what would it be like, for example, to give a 20-minute or a half hour or an hour-long speech on the Pnyx, as the Demosthenes did in the 4th century, when he and Aeschines debated about the policy that Athens ought to have toward the Macedonians. Well, if you spent time on the Pnyx, even in its present state, you might recognize that it would be a challenging thing to do. And only the most robust of speakers with physical stamina and great lung power and strong diaphragms. In that respect, giving a speech would be akin, I think, to a Pavarotti performing at an outdoor setting, as he did, of course, many times, and having that vocal control, that breath control, and the physical demands on the speaker. I mean, we're in a small room here, and so presumably you can hear me well. Anybody who cannot hear me, by the way, I was asked if I wanted to be mic'd, but I chose not to. If I get too quiet, let me know. But in any case, in an outdoor setting like that, and to be able to be heard by people who might be 20, 30, 40 meters distance, over 100 feet away. Not to mention, as Rosemary alluded to, the back talk, as it were. I think of Greek oratory taking place in settings often, certainly in the law courts, the council house, and in the assembly places, where it would be akin to the meetings of Parliament when the Prime Minister goes in front of Parliament and addresses them, and they're booing and hissing, they're talking back, saying, no, and or here, and so on and so forth. There's an awful lot of commotion going on there anyway. How is the speaker to be heard in those circumstances? Well, as our project thus far has indicated, in some cases that was indeed a problem. But in any case, we're looking at a kind of activity that is akin to an athletic activity. And there is no accident that there is physical training involved for oratory, just as there is for opera, singing, and indeed for some other things as well. One of my colleagues at Penn State, Deborah Hahi, has written a book called Rhetoric as a Bodily Art, and indeed likens gymnastics training, or physical training, and training for rhetoric as being akin to one another. It's a physically demanding task. So, what were those sorts of demands? Both for the speaker in terms of orating and being heard and being compelling, and for listeners, what would the experience have been like to actually hear, especially hear from the most eloquent of speakers. So that's what we set out to do. We want to look at the various kinds of contexts that we have, we find in terms of Greek antiquity, and we started really in the kind of late archaic period, going back to the late 6th century, but most of our work is being focused on the 5th and 4th centuries during the classical period, with some attention to Hellenistic sites as well, primarily because some of the best preserved speaking sites in Asia Minor are Hellenistic. They're best preserved because they were made from stone rather than from mud brick and wooden benches and so on. So we can get a lot of usable evidence from them. As part of our effort to do this, we've engaged in kind of 3 interrelated activities. One, as I've already mentioned, to collect as much material evidence as we could about the various sites we're interested in, the kinds of settings we're interested in, from the archaeological scholarship, from our own on-site visits. Second, to use the data thereby collected, and working with an architecture graduate student in the Art of Architecture at Penn State, who is competent in computer-generated imagery, using the measurements, the archaeologist reconstructions of some of these settings. She has, and you'll see some of these tonight, developed for us sets of very detailed, and we're trying to make them as precise and accurate as we can given the evidence that we have, very accurate and detailed representations, renderings, models of some of these settings. exact to the measurements, with the same kinds of materials represented and so on. So we've got that as part of it, and that's what you'll see some of this evening. And then the third component is using that information, dimensions, width, depth, height, building materials, mud brick covered with stucco, finished limestone, unfinished limestone, terracotta roof, internal timbers, open air, slopes, slope seating, flat seating, so on and so forth. Have had, again, a graduate student in the Department of Acoustical Engineering at Penn State use those data and do mathematical acoustical analyses of the acoustical properties, the likely acoustical properties of those various kinds of settings. And so what we'll report when this book is finished, hopefully within the next year or so, are the results of those interconnected forms of inquiry. What I'm going to do tonight is, as I say, kind of report on a sample of that. The book itself is concentrating on speech settings, primarily of the three types that Aristotle identifies in his Rhetoric. And so deliberative settings, legislative settings, so we're looking at meeting places of city assemblies, ecclesiasteria, and city councils, the bullateria, and those are the two that I'll focus on this evening. We're looking likewise at forensic or judicial discourse, so law courts, and the various kinds of structures that were used for law courts. And then finally, at epideictic settings. The epideictic genre is that category that Aristotle connects with speeches for special occasions. He focuses in particular on speeches given at festivals. So for instance, Gorgias gave his encomium of Helen, presumably in connection with some kind of an oratorical contest. He gave speeches at Olympia and at Delphi, again as part of the contestive or the agonistic themes, the athletic games, poetry contests, dramatic contests, and oratorical contests. And then also eulogies, given at gravesites. So we're looking at those sorts of epideictic settings. We also know of epideictic discourses, speeches made for, in some cases, the display of the orator's own virtuosity, being given in private homes. And indeed, many of the sophists gave their presentations to small groups of hearers in private homes. So we're also looking at the configuration of Greek houses, here in Athens in particular. So as another sort of setting where we might have expected to hear oratory presented in the classical and Hellenistic era. Because of the fact that when we're looking at civic discourse in particular, we are looking at male-dominated discourse, in fact exclusively male discourse, we wanted also to see what we could discover about the kinds of settings in which women's speech might take place. Clearly not public speeches, per se, but women communicate, after all. And so we have been looking likewise at the kinds of settings where they would have talked with one another, not in an oratorical sense, but perhaps in a rhetorical sense, if by rhetoric we mean communication aimed at influencing other people. And certainly, women from various households meeting at the southeast or southwest fountain house, meeting in private homes, in the marketplace, and so on, would have engaged in their own forms of communication. And we're looking at that as well to see, of course, there's very, very little evidence of what was said, no evidence of that to speak of, except for in some place. And the material evidence is kind of scarce as well. But we're doing what we can as well, so we'll be having some discussion of those things in addition to the civic sphere. So, what I'm going to focus on tonight will be the two subcategories in the general genre of deliberative oratory, focusing in particular on the kind of rhetorical performances that took place in assembly meeting places, meetings of the ecclesia, and then of the councils, the bullateria, and focusing primarily here in Athens because we have the most physical and in most cases literary evidence for Athens. But there are some examples I'll show you from elsewhere in the Greek world as well, just to kind of further illustrate the point. What I'm going to start with is kind of a general orientation with respect to the kind of geographical scope of our study, and then we'll get into Athens in particular and move into the settings from there. So, this would probably be a good time to dim the front lights if we might do that. So I'm rolling my sleeve, it means I'm about to get to work now. All this has been prelude. This sort of delineates the scope of the study that I described earlier on, from Magna Graecia in the west here to the Ionian areas of western Anatolia, and then the southwest edge as well. Down here, not specifically Hellenic sites, but many of the theaters in particular that were constructed in this part of Asia Minor were patterned on Greek models. So even if they were late Hellenistic or even Roman, they were built on Greek models, and often cases they were built on foundations of an earlier pre-existing Greek theater, certainly out here in the southwest. Sicily, you get a sense of what some of the, rather southern Italy and Sicily, some of the sites we'll be looking at there, and my colleague, Professor Graff, is currently looking at reconstructing some of the outstanding settings in those places. I've spent some time in Asia Minor over the last 25 years and have visited a good number of these sites, and again have tried to survey what's there and taken measurements, and in some cases tried things out. And I should have mentioned, by the way, forgive me for kind of omitting this, that the acoustical evidence that we're using in acoustical analyses do rest to a great extent on the mathematical modeling that the acoustical engineering person is doing for us. But we've also been doing some on-site testing, and as my students can themselves attest, and this will be true to my group going back to 1991, when we go to the Pnyx, we take terms orating. We read from, I think it was Demosthenes' first Philippic, was it not? And so we've taken turns sort of reproducing what the first phase of the Pnyx might have been like in order to do that. We've done some things likewise in various theater settings around. So got some kind of on-site evidence in addition to the mathematical modeling. Then here in central Greece proper, the mainland and the Peloponnesus, as we say, we're going to be spending time here in Athens this evening. We'll do a little bit down in Megalopoli and Messini. I neglected to point them out, I should do that. I will take you briefly to Priene and to Miletos here to take a look at a couple of the settings that we've been researching there. So focusing now on Athens, and for those of you who are recently arrived, will be studying this for the course of the next few months. Kind of a good thing for you to get kind of the maps ingrained in here. So obviously kind of overview of the ancient city, the Piraeus, the long walls. I think Glyphatis down around here somewhere, where now the good weather's with us, and some of the other folks have been going down there in afternoons. Our focus will be here, of course. And again, this very lovely watercolor rendition of essentially the same thing with the western or northern long wall. That would be another one would be here, the south wall down to Piraeus and up to Athens. And then Athens proper, kind of topography is sort of interesting here. We'll be spending time here in the agora and the Pnyx, and you see some of the rest of this. This, by the way, is the outline of the Panathenaic Stadium, which is just down the way here. So at this moment, we're just kind of right about there, I think. So you should know where you are. I think it's always useful to know where you are. And then here, again, a nice graphic representation, again, by way of orientation. The Panathenaic Stadium is just off the slide here. But of course, you see the Acropolis, the ancient agora. This is toward the end of the 5th century view, the Pnyx here, the fortification walls and so on. We'll be spending our time primarily here and at the Pnyx. And we'll begin with the agora itself. The An earlier agora in Athens was located elsewhere. This is the agora that seems to have emerged during the 6th century following Solon's constitutional reforms of 594 BCE. And the others, kind of one off to the south side of the Areopagus and the other apparently to the east of this situation. This, of course, is a major archaeological site in contemporary Athens, and I'm sure some of you will be spending time there, and some of you may already have done so, as a matter of fact. So around 520, just toward the end of the 6th century, very little in the way of civic architecture here. We have the southeast fountain house, the layout of the Panathenaic Way, of course, altar of the 12 gods, Market Hill or Agora Hill here, and this so-called Building F, which has been identified tentatively in various ways, perhaps at this point, as the palace of the Pisistrated family. Pisistratus is, of course, the 6th century tyrant, and then succeeded by his sons. It figures a little later on, perhaps, into early civic architecture of classical Greece. We move on to for the turn of the century. We find the development further here. This Building F has now been, according to this identification, its use has been changed perhaps from the private palace of the tyrant to a civic function here, the Praetenikon, the meeting place of the Praetenian, or the Praetenes, excuse me, that group of public officials who oversaw the day-to-day functioning of the polis, drawn certainly after the reforms of Cleisthenes in the late 6th century from the membership of the Council of 500 here. We also see, having been built in the late 6th century, 503, 502, somewhere in there, the old Bouleuterion, the Heliaia, tentatively identified in, I won't bore you with the complexities of all this. Many of these labels are now outdated. It's unclear whether the term Heliaia refers to a building or just to the law system or the court system generally, but in any case, perhaps a structure, an early structure that may have been used for as an early law court. And then a few shrines, we see the royal stoa, the stoa of the archon, of the king archons, that was a, I guess where you'd say the magistrate had his official space. A little further on, toward the end of that century, you can see quite a proliferation of civic structures and some commercial as well. We see now, of course, as a result of the Heraclean building program, the old Bouleuterion, which, by the way, appears to have been used both as a council house and as the storage place of the city's archives, perhaps from the very beginning. Certainly became known during the 5th century as the old Bouleuterion, as the Bouleuterion Metroon. And indeed, after the construction toward the end of the 5th century, 404, 403, of the new Bouleuterion, it became used solely as the repository for the city's archives, all its written documents, laws, decrees, and so on, and was known then and thereafter as the Metroon. The Building F has been succeeded by the Tholos, this round building, so the meeting place of the Praetenes there. You see this sometimes called a rectangular perivolis, or the Achaeon later on, again identified tentatively as a law court. We see now the construction of the South Stoa, commercial spaces used in there, Southeast Fountain House, the Mint, another courtroom appearing over here. In addition to the Royal Stoa, now the construction of the Painted Stoa on the far side of the Panathenaic Way, and of course the construction of the Hephaestion on the hill, which still stands out there. This is still being excavated even as we speak, and when you make your trips to the agora, you'll see the foundations of some of these other things. We proceed, we'll be focusing in the 5th century for the most part here. You see that in the 4th century we get further elaboration of this civic buildings here, more law court spaces over here, these early law courts succeeded by the square Paris style, and then elaboration here with another fountain house, and so on. And then by the time we get to the 2nd century, getting pretty full up. And if you take a look, if you visit the Acropolis Museum, for example, and they have a series of models of glass cases in their lobby, you ought to take a look at them because it shows the progression